September 20th, 1973. Jim Croce stood backstage at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, Louisiana, towel pressed against his neck, sweat dripping down his temples. The crowd was still roaring outside. 3 encores. They'd wanted 4, but his voice was shot, vocal cords scraped raw from 67 shows in 89 days. His manager, Terry, walked over holding 2 bottles of beer, handed him one without saying anything. They both knew what the other was thinking. This pace was killing him, but the money was finally coming in. Jim took a long pull from the bottle, felt the cold spread through his chest. 6 months ago, he was working construction in Philadelphia, coming home with concrete dust in his lungs and $12 in his pocket. Now Bad Bad Leroy Brown was #1 on Billboard for 2 weeks straight. Time in a Bottle was climbing fast. The album had gone gold in July. His accountant called yesterday saying the royalty check cleared $243,000, more money than his father made in 15 years of factory work. Terry lit a cigarette, exhaled toward the ceiling. Robert says the plane's ready. We can leave in 40 minutes. Jim nodded but didn't move. His guitar tech was already packing up the Martin. The band was loading equipment into the truck. Maury Muehleisen, his lead guitarist, walked past carrying his Gibson, gave Jim a tired smile. Maury never complained, but Jim could see it in his posture, shoulders curved forward like he was carrying something heavier than an instrument. They'd become close on this tour, writing songs together in hotel rooms at 3 in the morning when neither could sleep. Maury had a wife back home too. They both did. Ingrid had called before the show. Their son AJ turned 2 next week, and Jim was supposed to be home, supposed to blow out candles and open presents and be a father instead of a ghost who sent postcards. Ingrid's voice on the phone was steady, but he heard what lived underneath. How many times can you miss his birthday? How many times can you choose the road? She didn't say it, but he heard it anyway. We could drive, Jim said, knowing even as the words left his mouth how stupid they sounded. Rent a van. Get there tomorrow afternoon. Terry looked at him like he'd suggested walking. You got Good Morning America on Friday in New York. Then the Carson Show taping Monday. We drive. You miss both. That's 3 million people who don't see your face. Jim finished the beer, set the empty bottle on an amp case. Through the thin walls he could hear the venue staff stacking chairs, doors banging, someone laughing. Normal sounds. People doing regular jobs, going home to regular lives. The Beechcraft E18S was waiting at Natchitoches Regional Airport, a charter plane they'd used twice before on this leg of the tour. Robert Elliott had been flying them for 3 weeks, 57 years old, veteran pilot with 20,000 hours logged. Quiet guy. Didn't talk much, but he got them where they needed to go. The plane itself was older, built in 1954. Twin-engine prop job that rattled when it hit turbulence but never failed. Jim had asked Robert about it once, joking nervous, and Robert had patted the fuselage like it was a loyal dog. She's got more life in her than both of us combined. Terry crushed his cigarette under his boot. Bus leaves in 20. You coming or you want to walk home? Jim picked up his guitar case. Through the back door he could see the Louisiana night, thick and humid, stars buried under clouds. Somewhere out there Ingrid was putting AJ to bed, reading him the book about the train that could. Somewhere out there was a life he kept promising he'd return to when things settled down, when the tour ended, when the album cycle finished. Always when. Never now. He followed Terry toward the exit. The band was already outside loading into the small bus that would take them to the airport. 6 people total making the flight. Jim, Terry, Maury, the bassist Kenneth, the comedian George who opened their shows, and Robert up front flying them through the dark. Nobody knew it yet, but they had 90 minutes left to live. The bus rattled down Highway 49 toward the airport, headlights cutting through humidity so thick it looked like smoke. Jim sat in the back row, forehead pressed against the window, watching pine trees blur past in the darkness. His reflection stared back at him, distorted in the glass, a ghost of a man who used to frame houses and now filled stadiums. Maury sat across the aisle tuning his guitar, even though they weren't playing anywhere tonight. fingers moving through chord progressions like a nervous habit he couldn't break. Kenneth dozed with his head tilted back, mouth open, snoring softly. George was up front telling Terry some story about a bar fight in Memphis, his voice rising and falling with punchlines nobody laughed at because they'd all heard it before. The show had gone well, better than well, the crowd screaming every word back at him like they'd written the songs themselves. But something felt off tonight, had felt off since they'd arrived in Natchitoches that morning. The sound check ran long because the monitors kept feeding back. The dressing room door wouldn't lock. During the third song, someone threw a bottle that shattered near the drum kit, and security had to pull a guy out. 20 years old and drunk and crying, saying he just wanted to touch Jim's guitar. Small things, meaningless things, but they stacked up in Jim's mind like loose change in a jar, too many to ignore. Terry had mentioned earlier that the flight plan got changed, something about weather patterns and air traffic control in Shreveport, but Jim hadn't paid attention to the details. He trusted Robert to handle it. That's what you did with pilots. You trusted them because the alternative was driving yourself crazy, thinking about everything that could go wrong at 3,500 feet. Robert had met them at the venue before the show, walked through with his clipboard checking names against the manifest. His face serious and professional, like he was transporting the president instead of a folk singer and his road-worn band. He'd seemed normal. Tired maybe, circles under his eyes darker than usual, but normal. The airport came into view, a small regional facility with 2 runways and a control tower that looked like someone's garage. The bus pulled up to the chain-link gate and idled while Terry got out to unlock it, flashlight beams sweeping across empty tarmac. Jim could see the Beechcraft parked near the hangar, its twin propellers catching orange light from the sodium lamps overhead. The plane looked smaller than he remembered, narrow fuselage with rounded nose, wings that seemed too delicate to hold 6 men and all their equipment. But it had flown them from Oklahoma City to Dallas to Houston without incident, had carried them through thunderstorms and crosswinds, had always delivered them safely to the next town and the next show, and the next hotel room that smelled like cigarettes and industrial carpet cleaner. They unloaded their gear slowly, nobody rushing because the flight wasn't scheduled until 10:30, and it was only 10:15 now. Jim carried his guitar case and a small duffel with tomorrow's clothes, everything else shipped ahead to the hotel in Texas. Maury walked beside him, not talking, just present in that way he had of being good company, without filling silence with noise. Kenneth was complaining about the heat, wiping his face with a bandana already soaked through. George lit a cigarette and Terry told him to put it out near the fuel tanks, and George laughed but did it anyway, grinding the butt under his heel. Robert appeared from inside the hangar, walked toward them with his pilot's case in one hand. He was wearing his standard outfit, white shirt with epaulettes, dark slacks, polished shoes that reflected the overhead lights. His hair was graying at the temples, face weathered from years of flying in sun and wind. He nodded at the group, started his pre-flight check without saying much, circling the plane with a flashlight, inspecting flaps and rudders and landing gear. Jim watched him work, methodical and thorough, touching every surface like he was making sure the aircraft was real and not some fever dream. Then something strange happened, small enough that Jim almost didn't notice. A man in a dark suit appeared near the hangar entrance, stood there watching them for maybe 30 seconds, then disappeared back inside. Jim had never seen him before, didn't recognize him as airport staff or security. Just a figure in the shadows, observing. When Jim glanced at Terry to see if he'd noticed, Terry was busy organizing luggage weights with Kenneth, not paying attention to anything except balance and distribution. Robert finished his inspection, gave them a thumbs up. "We're good to go, little overweight but nothing she can't handle. Weather's clear all the way to Texas. Should be smooth flying." They began loading into the plane through the rear door. Cramped cabin with 6 seats facing each other, not enough headroom to stand fully upright. Jim took a seat on the left side, stowed his guitar in the narrow aisle. Maury sat across from him. Kenneth and George filled in behind. Terry climbed in last, pulled the door shut, secured the latch with 2 metallic clicks that echoed in the confined space. The interior smelled like oil and old upholstery, and something else Jim couldn't identify. something metallic and sharp. Robert climbed into the cockpit, separated from the passenger cabin by a thin partition. Through the gap, Jim could see him running through checklists, flipping switches, his hands moving with practiced efficiency across the instrument panel. The engines coughed once, twice, then roared to life, the whole plane shaking as the propellers spun up to speed. The vibration traveled through the floor, through the seats, through Jim's bones. He closed his eyes, tried to think about Ingrid and AJ, about being home in Pennsylvania where the air smelled like cut grass instead of jet fuel. The radio crackled, Robert's voice calm and steady. Natchitoches Tower, this is November 77. Oscar Hotel requesting clearance for departure runway 21. Static. Then a voice from the tower. November 77 Oscar Hotel. You're cleared for takeoff runway 21. Winds light and variable. Altimeter 2992. Robert didn't respond immediately. 5 seconds of silence. 10. Jim opened his eyes, saw Terry lean forward, about to say something. Then Robert's voice again. Roger, cleared for takeoff. The plane began to move, taxiing toward the runway. Engines screaming now, the whole aircraft rattling like it might shake itself apart. Jim gripped the armrests, knuckles white, telling himself this was normal. This was just how small planes sounded. Nothing to worry about. Maury caught his eye, gave him a small smile that said, We've done this before. We'll do it again. Kenneth was already asleep somehow. George stared out the window at the lights of Natchitoches falling away behind them. They reached the runway. Robert throttled up, and the Beechcraft began to accelerate faster and faster, the world outside becoming a blur of darkness and distant stars. Jim felt the wheels leave the ground, felt that moment of terrifying freedom when metal and physics were all that kept you from falling. The plane climbed, nose angled upward, engines straining. 30 feet, 50 feet, 75. It was 10:52 at night, September 20th, 1973. In 90 seconds, none of them would be alive. The Beechcraft climbed through humid Louisiana air, engines roaring at full power, propellers chewing through darkness. Inside the cabin, Jim felt his stomach drop as the plane gained altitude, that sickening sensation of leaving solid ground behind. Through the small window, he could see the airport lights growing smaller, the runway becoming a thin line of orange against black earth. Maury had closed his eyes, head tilted back against the seat, lips moving silently in what might have been prayer or song lyrics. Terry was checking his watch, calculating arrival time, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The plane shuddered, hit a pocket of turbulence, and Jim's grip on the armrest tightened until his fingernails dug into the vinyl. Then something changed. A sound that didn't belong, a grinding mechanical shriek from somewhere deep in the aircraft structure. The nose dropped. Not slowly, not a gradual descent, but a sudden violent pitch forward like the plane had been yanked by invisible cables. Jim's body lurched against the seatbelt, guitar case sliding down the aisle with a metallic scrape. Kenneth woke up shouting, hands reaching for something to hold. George's face went white, mouth open, no sound coming out. The engines were still screaming, but the plane was falling, really falling, nose pointed at the earth like a thrown spear. Robert was yelling something from the cockpit, words lost in the engine noise and the wind that suddenly howled through gaps in the fuselage. Jim could see his silhouette through the partition, both hands wrestling with the control column, shoulders straining with effort. The instrument panel lights reflected off his face, green and red, making him look inhuman. Terry unbuckled his seatbelt, tried to stand, got thrown back into his seat as the plane rolled left. Everything loose in the cabin became a projectile, bags and equipment, and Maury's guitar spinning through the air in slow motion. They were still climbing in altitude somehow, momentum carrying them upward even as the nose pointed down, physics playing a cruel joke. 100 feet, 150, 200. Then gravity won, and the Beechcraft began to drop for real, air speed increasing, metal groaning under forces it wasn't designed to handle. Jim thought about Ingrid, about AJ blowing out candles on a birthday cake he'd never see. He thought about all the songs still unwritten, melodies trapped in his head that would die with him. He thought about his father telling him music was a waste of time, that real men worked with their hands, and how badly he'd wanted to prove him wrong. The ground was rushing up to meet them now, dark shapes of trees materializing out of nothing. Robert pulled back on the controls, trying to level out, but the plane didn't respond. Something was broken. Cables snapped, or hydraulics failed, or engine mounts sheared. Some catastrophic failure that turned a functioning aircraft into a falling coffin. Maury reached across the aisle, grabbed Jim's hand, squeezed it once. His palm was cold and wet. They locked eyes for maybe 2 seconds, an entire conversation happening in silence. Then Maury closed his eyes again, and Jim did too, because he didn't want to see the moment of impact. The Beechcraft hit a pecan tree first, sheared off the right wing, spun the fuselage sideways. Metal screamed against wood, propeller blades disintegrating into shrapnel. The plane cartwheeled, nose digging into soft earth, tail section breaking away from the main body. Fire erupted from the fuel tanks, orange flame blooming in the darkness like a demonic flower. The cockpit crushed inward, instrument panel punching through the partition into the passenger cabin. Seats ripped free from their mounting bolts. Bodies became ragdolls, thrown against walls and ceiling and floor with enough force to shatter bone. It happened in 3 seconds, maybe 4. The human brain can't really process that kind of violence, can't catalogue each moment of destruction as it occurs. There's just the before and the after, and between them a void where consciousness shuts down to protect itself from understanding its own annihilation. Jim Croce was alive when the plane left the runway. He was dead before the fire reached him. They all were. Robert Elliott, Maury Muehleisen, Kenneth Edwards, George Stevens, Terry Cashman. 6 men who woke up that morning and ate breakfast and brushed their teeth and made phone calls. 6 men who existed in the world with thoughts and memories, and people who loved them, reduced to statistics in a crash report. The first person to reach the wreckage was a farmer named Dale who lived 1/4 mile away. He'd heard the engines, looked up from his television, saw the plane struggling to gain altitude, watched it fall. Grabbed a flashlight and ran across his property in bare feet, burrs tearing his skin, breath ragged in his chest. When he got there, the fire was already spreading, flames licking up through shattered fuselage, smoke pouring into the night sky. He could see bodies inside, or pieces of bodies, shapes that had been people 90 seconds ago. He tried to get closer, but the heat drove him back, singeing the hair on his arms. He stood there helpless, flashlight beam cutting through smoke, and screamed for help that wouldn't arrive for another 12 minutes. The official investigation began before the fire trucks even finished dousing the flames. National Transportation Safety Board sent a team from Dallas, arrived at sunrise to find the wreckage spread across 70 yards of farmland. They worked methodically, photographing every piece of debris, measuring distances, collecting samples. The lead investigator was a man named Carson, 30-year veteran who'd seen 100 crashes and could read wreckage like some people read books. He walked the debris field slowly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning for the story hidden in twisted metal and scorched earth. What he found didn't make sense. The engine mounts showed signs of fatigue failure, stress cracks that should have been caught during routine maintenance. The fuel system had leaks documented in previous inspection reports but never repaired. The plane was overweight by at least 400 pounds, loaded beyond its certified capacity. Robert Elliott had logged only 2 hours of sleep the night before, had been flying commercial routes all day before taking this charter. The weather was clear, but the runway at Natchitoches had inadequate lighting for night operations. Any one of these factors could cause an accident. Together they built a picture of disaster waiting to happen, but other things didn't fit. Witnesses near the airport reported seeing unusual activity around the hangar before takeoff, people who didn't work there. The flight plan had been changed twice in the hours before departure, routing adjusted for reasons nobody could explain. Several maintenance logs from the previous week were missing from the aircraft's documentation. The control tower recordings from that night had sections of static exactly when the Beechcraft was requesting clearance, gaps that made conversations impossible to verify. And strangest of all, the plane's so-called black box, the flight data recorder that should have captured every system reading from takeoff to impact, was never recovered. It simply vanished somewhere between the crash site and the NTSB facility. Carson wrote his report carefully, using language that said everything while committing to nothing. Probable cause, pilot error compounded by mechanical failure and overweight conditions. Contributing factors, inadequate maintenance and operational pressures. Recommendations, stricter enforcement of weight limits and mandatory rest periods for charter pilots. The file was stamped closed 4 months later. Case number 7-30218. 6 dead. Questions answered. Investigation complete. Except it wasn't complete. Not really. Because the people who knew Robert Elliott said he'd never made a mistake in 20,000 hours of flying. The mechanics who'd worked on that Beechcraft said they'd flagged those engine mounts for replacement, but someone higher up had signed off on another 100 hours. The airport staff said the man in the dark suit watching the loading process wasn't anyone they recognized. And Ingrid Croce, sitting in her house in Pennsylvania reading the official report, knew in her bones that something was being hidden, some truth buried under bureaucratic language and convenient conclusions. But proving it was impossible. The evidence was gone, burned or lost or deliberately destroyed. The witnesses were scattered, memories fading, nobody wanting to talk about that night anymore. And Jim was dead, along with everyone else who'd been in that plane, their voices silenced forever. All that remained were questions hanging in the air like smoke, and a wreckage field that told a story nobody wanted to hear. The theories started almost immediately, whispered in recording studios and music industry offices, passed between journalists who'd covered Jim's rise and now had to write his obituary. Why would a plane that had flown successfully for 19 years suddenly fail so catastrophically? Why were maintenance records incomplete? Who was the man in the dark suit at the airport? These questions circulated through Nashville and New York and Los Angeles, gathering weight like a snowball rolling downhill, picking up speculation and paranoia and half-remembered details that might mean nothing or might mean everything. Some people pointed to the money, always the money, because in the music business, everything eventually comes down to dollars and contracts and who owns what percentage of a man's voice. Jim had signed with ABC Records 3 years earlier, standard deal for a nobody folk singer, giving the label rights to his masters and a huge cut of publishing royalties. But Bad Leroy Brown changed everything, turned Jim from a side project into a profit center. His lawyer had been renegotiating the contract, pushing for better terms, threatening to walk if ABC didn't agree. The label stood to lose millions if Jim left, took his catalog to a competitor. People have been killed for less, much less. There were rumors about a meeting that took place 6 days before the crash, Jim and a man named Wallace at a hotel bar in Oklahoma City. Wallace worked for a subsidiary of ABC, one of those corporate entities buried so deep in parent companies that nobody could figure out exactly what he did. Multiple witnesses saw them talking, saw Wallace slide papers across the table, saw Jim shake his head and stand up to leave. Nobody heard what was said, but the body language was clear. Confrontation, disagreement, threat maybe. When reporters tried to find Wallace after the crash to ask about that conversation, he disappeared, transferred to some overseas division, unreachable. Then there was the pattern, if you believed in patterns. Buddy Holly, dead in a plane crash 1959. Patsy Cline, dead in a plane crash 1963. Otis Redding, dead in a plane crash 1967. Now Jim Croce, dead in a plane crash 1973. 4 major artists, 4 small aircraft, 4 investigations that concluded pilot error or mechanical failure or bad weather, 4 cases closed with questions unanswered. Maybe it was coincidence, random chance in an industry where people flew constantly in poorly maintained planes with overworked pilots. Or maybe someone had figured out that crashes were perfect covers, violent enough to destroy evidence, tragic enough to discourage deep investigation, common enough to seem like just another terrible accident. The conspiracy theorists on early internet forums years later would connect even more dots. They'd point out that all 4 artists had been renegotiating contracts or considering label changes when they died. They'd note that insurance payouts after fatal accidents often exceeded what the artists would have earned alive. They'd find connections between board members of different record labels, overlapping investors, shared legal teams. They'd build elaborate theories about industry-wide collusion, about a shadow organization that eliminated troublesome talent, about accidents that were really executions. Most of it was nonsense, pattern-seeking in random noise. But buried in the paranoia were fragments of truth, uncomfortable questions about power and money, and how far people will go to protect both. Ingrid hired a private investigator in 1974, a former FBI agent named Marcus, who specialized in aviation incidents. She paid him $12,000 over 6 months to dig into everything the NTSB had overlooked or ignored. Marcus was thorough, interviewed everyone who'd been near that airport, tracked down maintenance crews, pulled financial records on the charter company. What he found was disturbing, but not conclusive. The Beechcraft had been purchased 2 months before the crash by a shell corporation registered in Delaware, ownership buried behind layers of legal entities. The previous owner said he'd sold it because the engines were shot, needed complete overhaul, but somehow it passed inspection and got cleared for commercial charters. 3 mechanics who'd worked on the plane in August reported safety concerns to their supervisor, concerns that never made it into official documentation. Marcus also discovered that Robert Elliott, the pilot, had gambling debts. $47,000 owed to bookies in 3 states, the kind of debt that gets you hurt if you don't pay. 2 weeks before the crash, someone had paid off $15,000 of it. Wire transfer from an account Marcus couldn't trace. He interviewed Robert's widow, asked if her husband had seemed stressed or frightened in the days before the flight. She said yes, said Robert had been getting phone calls at odd hours, said he'd come home one night with bruises on his ribs he wouldn't explain. But she also said Robert loved flying, would never deliberately crash a plane, would never hurt innocent people, no matter how much money or fear was involved. Marcus believed her. He'd seen enough corruption to know it rarely required villains, just desperate people making bad choices under pressure. The investigation went nowhere. Every lead ended in dead ends or sealed records or people who suddenly refused to talk. Marcus wrote a 50-page report detailing his findings, conclusions carefully hedged with legal language, but the core message was clear. Something happened that night that had nothing to do with pilot error or mechanical failure. Someone wanted that plane to crash. Whether they sabotaged it directly or created conditions that made disaster inevitable, the result was the same. 6 men dead. Evidence destroyed, truth buried. Ingrid read the report 3 times, each reading making her angrier and more helpless. What was she supposed to do with this information? Go to the media? They'd been over the story already, milked it for headlines, moved on to fresher tragedies. Sue the charter company? They'd declared bankruptcy 4 months after the crash, assets liquidated, owners vanished. Demand the NTSB reopen the investigation? They'd politely declined, case closed, no new evidence to warrant review. She was one woman against an industry that had decades of practice making inconvenient questions disappear. So she made a choice. She stopped looking, packed away Marcus's report in a box with Jim's old notebooks and stage clothes, put it in the attic, tried to move forward. She had a son to raise, bills to pay, a life to rebuild from wreckage. The truth, whatever it was, wouldn't bring Jim back, wouldn't let her hear his voice again or feel his arms around her or watch him teach AJ how to play guitar. The truth was just more pain dressed up as justice, and she'd had enough pain to last 3 lifetimes. But she never forgot, never stopped wondering, and when journalists would call on anniversaries of the crash asking for quotes about Jim's legacy, she'd always end the interview the same way. There's more to the story than what you read in the official report. Someday maybe someone will tell it. Then she'd hang up before they could ask what she meant, before they could push for details she couldn't prove, before she'd have to admit that knowing something and proving it are 2 completely different things. The files remain sealed to this day. NTSB records from that investigation are classified for 75 years, won't be available to the public until 2048. The reasons given are standard bureaucratic explanations about privacy and ongoing legal considerations. Nothing that raises red flags unless you're already suspicious. Most people aren't. Most people believe the official story because believing otherwise means accepting that the world is darker and more corrupt than they want to imagine. Easier to think it was just an accident, just bad luck, just one of those terrible things that happen sometimes for no reason at all. But Wallace, the man from the hotel bar in Oklahoma City, he knows different. He's 83 now, living in a retirement community in Arizona, spending his days playing cards and watching cable news. Sometimes at night he lies awake thinking about that conversation, about the papers he pushed across the table, about Jim's face when he understood what was really being offered. Sometimes he wonders if things could have gone differently, if Jim had just signed, if the plane had never taken off. But mostly he doesn't think about it at all because thinking about it doesn't change anything, and guilt is just another weight old men carry until they die. Jim Croce's funeral was held on September 25, 1973, at Haym Salomon Memorial Park in Pennsylvania. 2,000 people showed up, overflowing the chapel, standing in the rain outside because there wasn't room for everyone who wanted to pay respects. His guitar sat on a stand next to the casket, the Martin he'd played on stage 5 nights before, strings still holding the last notes he'd ever touched. Ingrid sat in the front row holding AJ, who was too young to understand why everyone was crying, why his father wasn't coming home this time. The service lasted 40 minutes, but Ingrid only remembered fragments, disconnected moments that surfaced later, like debris from a shipwreck, the sound of rain on the roof. Someone singing "Time in a Bottle" with a voice that broke halfway through. AJ asking if Daddy was sleeping. The music industry mourned publicly. Tributes poured in from artists who'd opened for Jim, or shared stages with him, or simply admired his songwriting. Billboard ran a cover story. Rolling Stone published a retrospective. Radio stations played his songs on loop for weeks. Bad, Bad Leroy Brown, climbing back up the charts propelled by Tragedy. His album sales quadrupled overnight. Demand so high that ABC Records had to run extra pressing shifts. There was something grotesque about it, the way death transformed an artist into a commodity even more valuable than when he'd been alive. But that's how the machine worked, grinding forward regardless of who got crushed beneath the wheels. Time in a Bottle was released as a single in December, 3 months after Jim died. It hit #1 in January 1974, topped the charts for 2 weeks, sold over 2 million copies. Jim had written it for AJ's first birthday, sitting in their small apartment in Philadelphia before the record deals and the fame, trying to capture something about fatherhood and time and how nothing lasts forever. Now it played in grocery stores and shopping malls and car radios across America, a dead man's voice singing about wanting more time with his son, the irony so brutal it felt like punishment. Ingrid couldn't listen to it, would turn off the radio whenever it came on, would leave restaurants if it started playing through overhead speakers. She didn't need a song to remind her what she'd lost. AJ grew up with a ghost for a father, photographs and stories and vinyl records, but no actual memory of the man. People would tell him he looked like Jim, had the same eyes, same smile, same stubborn streak. Teachers would recognize his last name and ask if he was related, their faces doing that sympathetic tilt when he said yes. He learned to hate those conversations, the way people projected their own nostalgia onto him, expected him to be a monument to someone he'd never known. By the time he was 15, he'd stopped telling people who his father was, just said his dad died when he was young and changed the subject before they could press for details. Ingrid remarried in 1977, a good man named Paul, who worked as an accountant and never tried to replace Jim, but gave her something Jim never could, stability and presence, and a partner who came home every night. They had a daughter together, gave AJ a sister, built a life that had nothing to do with tour buses and recording studios and planes that fell from the sky. Ingrid opened a restaurant in San Diego using money from Jim's royalties, called it Croce's, filled it with photographs and memorabilia, created a space where his music could live without haunting her. It became successful, a destination for fans who wanted to feel close to Jim's legacy. She'd walk through during dinner service, see people pointing at pictures on the walls, humming along to songs playing over the sound system, and feel something complicated that wasn't quite pride or grief, but existed somewhere between them. She never spoke publicly about Marcus's investigation, or the unanswered questions or her suspicions about what really happened that night. What would be the point? The people who cared about conspiracy theories would twist her words into whatever narrative they wanted. The people who believed the official story would dismiss her as a grieving widow, unable to accept random tragedy. And the people responsible, if there were people responsible, were beyond reach, protected by time and legal barriers and the fundamental impossibility of proving something that had been carefully designed to look like an accident. So she stayed silent, let Jim's music speak for itself, let his legacy be about the songs instead of the suspicious circumstances of his death. The internet changed things, brought new attention to old mysteries. Amateur investigators built websites dedicated to Jim's crash, compiled evidence, interviewed witnesses the NTSB had ignored, created timelines and diagrams and arguments for why the official explanation didn't hold up. Some of it was credible, careful analysis of maintenance records and financial connections. Most of it was noise, people seeing patterns in chaos because patterns are more comforting than accepting that sometimes bad things just happen for no reason. Ingrid never engaged with any of it, never commented on forums or corrected misconceptions or validated theories. She'd made her peace, or something close to peace, and dredging up the past wouldn't change the present. AJ eventually came to terms with his father's absence, the way children of dead parents always do, carrying the weight but learning to walk with it. He never became a musician, deliberately chose a different path, became a software engineer in Seattle, as far from the music industry as he could get while still remaining on Earth, but he kept one of Jim's guitars, the Martin from the funeral, stored in a climate-controlled case in his closet. Took it out once a year on September 20th, sat with it for an hour without playing, just holding it, connecting to a man he'd never known through wood and wire and the ghost of melodies. The truth about what happened that night is probably lost forever, buried with the people who knew it or locked in files that won't be opened for another 23 years. Maybe in 2048, someone will request those NTSB documents, find smoking gun evidence of sabotage or conspiracy or criminal negligence. Maybe they'll find nothing, just confirmation that it really was an accident, a convergence of bad luck and human error and mechanical failure. Either way, Jim Croce will still be dead, still frozen at 30 years old, still that voice on scratchy recordings singing about time in bottles and bad men named Leroy Brown. His songs outlived him, which is what every artist hopes for but few achieve. They play at weddings and funerals and graduation parties, soundtrack moments in strangers' lives, carry emotional weight far beyond their original context. People who weren't born when Jim died know every word to Operator, and I Got a Name, pass them down to their own children, keep the music alive even as the man fades into history. That's the legacy that matters, not the conspiracy theories or the unanswered questions or the files gathering dust in some government warehouse. The legacy is the music, pure and simple, 3-minute stories about love and loss and the complicated math of being human. Ingrid Croce died in 2015 at age 70, heart failure, surrounded by family. Her last request was to be buried next to Jim, reunited after 42 years of separation. AJ arranged it, stood in the rain again at Haim Salomon Memorial Park. Deja vu so strong it felt like time had folded in on itself. His sister held his hand. His wife stood beside him with their teenage daughter, Jim's granddaughter, who had his eyes and his smile and absolutely no interest in becoming a musician. The service was small, private, no media or fans or people treating it like a pilgrimage, just family saying goodbye to someone they loved. As they lowered Ingrid's casket into the ground, AJ thought about the secret she'd carried, the questions she'd stopped asking, the choice she'd made to let the past stay buried. He wondered if she'd been right, if some mysteries were better left unsolved, If the not knowing was actually kinder than whatever terrible truth might be waiting in those sealed files, he decided she probably was right, decided he wouldn't request those documents when they became available. Decided to let his father rest, let the music be enough, let the dead keep their secrets. The rain fell on fresh-turned earth, same as it had 42 years before, time's bottle finally empty.